Our reading today is found in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 41 through 49. This is the word of Yahweh. Then Moses set apart on the east side of the Jordan 3 cities, to which a homicide could flee, someone who unintentionally kills another person, the two not having been at enmity before. The homicide could flee to one of these cities and live: Bezer, in the wilderness on the tableland belonging to the Reubenites; Ramoth in Gilead belonging to the Gadites; and Golan in Bashan belonging to the Manassites. This is the law that Moses set before the Israelites. These are the decrees and the statutes and ordinances that Moses spoke to the Israelites when they had come out of Egypt, beyond the Jordan in the valley opposite Beit Peor, in the land of King Sihon of the Amorites, who reigned at Heshbon, whom Moses and the Israelites defeated when they came out of Egypt. They occupied his land and the land of King Og of Bashan, the two kings of the Amorites on the eastern side of the Jordan, from Aror, which is on the edge of the Wadi Arnon, as far as Mount Sirion, that is Hermon, together with all the Arabah on the east side of the Jordan, as far as the Sea of Arabah, under the slopes of Pisgah. In the covenant of Sinai, God required the Israelites to establish 6 cities, which in Hebrew were to be called Arei Miklat. In English, this is translated as cities of refuge or cities of asylum. 3 cities were to be found on the eastern side of the Jordan River, and the remaining 3 were to be on the western side. Officially, these cities were not parts of the tribes in which they resided, but instead were governed by the tribe of Levi, which had no tribal inheritance in Israel due to their service of God as priests and caretakers of the tabernacle and later the temple. Since the Israelites had conquered the nations on the eastern side of the Jordan just prior to the address of Moses recorded in Deuteronomy, Moses reminded the Israelites that 3 cities in this newly conquered territory were to be so designated. According to Moses, these 3 cities would be Bezer, Ramoth Gilead, and Golan. If one were to view these cities on a map, one would see that Bezer was in the south, Ramoth Gilead near the midpoint, and Golan in the north of Israel's eastern territory, so each of the cities were nearby for people who needed to go. What exactly were Arei Miklat, or cities of refuge? These cities were to serve 2 purposes. Moses highlighted one of their purposes in the passage we just read. According to Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 41 through 42, then Moses set apart on the east side of the Jordan 3 cities, to which a homicide could flee, someone who unintentionally kills another person, the two not having been at enmity before. The homicide could flee to one of these cities and live. Here Moses reminded the Israelites that these cities would serve in part as places in which those who committed unintentional murder might live in safety. Why would this be necessary? To address this question, we must return to the book of Genesis. After God destroyed all land-based life in the Great Flood, God made a covenant with the only surviving humans on earth, Noah and his family. God's covenant with Noah has been preserved in Genesis chapter 8, verse 20 through chapter 9, verse 17, which reads as follows. Then Noah built an altar to Yahweh, and took of every clean animal and of every clean bird, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And when Yahweh smelled the pleasing odor, Yahweh said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of humankind, for the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth, nor will I ever again destroy every living creature as I have done. As long as the earth endures, seedtime and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. Elohim blessed Noah and his sons, and said to them, Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth. The fear and dread of you shall rest on every animal of the earth, and on every bird of the air, on everything that creeps on the ground, and on all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. And just as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. Only you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. For your own lifeblood I will surely require a reckoning. From every animal I will require it, and from human beings, each one for the blood of another. I will require a reckoning for human life. Whoever sheds the blood of a human, by a human shall that person's blood be shed. For in his own image Elohim made humankind. And you be fruitful and multiply, abound on the earth and multiply in it. Then Elohim said to Noah and to his sons with him, As for me, I am establishing my covenant with you and your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the domestic animals, and every animal of the earth with you, as many as came out of the ark. I establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. Elohim said, This is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you, for all future generations. I have set my bow in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh, and the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it, and remember the everlasting covenant between Elohim and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. Elohim said to Noah, This is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth. When God first created humanity on the earth, Genesis chapter 1 verses 28 through 30 tells us the following. Elohim blessed them, and Elohim said to them, Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth. Elohim said, See, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food. And it was so. We notice that in the wake of humanity's rebellion against God in the Garden of Eden, our ever-increasing wickedness and violence upon the earth, and the subsequent destruction of all land-based life in the flood, the covenant that God made with Noah differed from the one he had first made with humanity at the beginning. For instance, in the original covenant, God had given both humans and animals every green plant for food. However, in the later covenant God made with Noah, Genesis 9, verses 2 through 3 has told us, The fear and dread of you shall rest on every animal of the earth, and on every bird of the air, and on everything that creeps on the ground, and on all fish of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you, and just as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. Does this mean that humans were vegetarians prior to God's covenant with Noah? That is difficult to say, especially since many of Adam and Eve's descendants up until the flood were not attempting to live in relationship with God and in submission to God's requirements. Also, Genesis has told us that Adam and Eve's son Abel was a keeper of sheep. Even more, we're told in Genesis chapter 4, verse 4, that Abel sacrificed a firstling of his flock to God as an offering. Does this mean that even Abel was eating the meat of lambs that he tended? Though the scriptures are not explicit, given God's pleasure with Abel's sacrifice, along with God's granting to humans only green plants for food to that point, my suspicion is that Abel's sacrifice was what would later be called a whole burnt offering. That is, the entire animal was consumed in the fire, none of it being eaten by the offerer. Additionally, I would suspect that Abel raised and tended flocks at that time for their wool and perhaps milk, but not for meat. Even so, it is both possible and likely that later humans, particularly those in the line of Abel's brother Cain, who did not walk with God, may have taken to eating meat long before the days of Noah. Of course, of that we can't be sure. What is clear is that the permission to eat meat was not given from God to humans explicitly until the covenant God made with Noah. However, in addition to the permission to eat meat, in addition to the fruit of green plants, God provided additional guidelines which were to be followed. In the beginning, the only rules God had given humans were as follows: Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, subdue the earth, have dominion over all God's living creatures, and do not eat from the tree of knowledge, which resides in the center of the Garden of Eden. To these guidelines for living, Genesis chapter 9 verses 3 through 6 has told us that God added the following in the covenant that he made with Noah. Additionally, you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. Second, whoever sheds the blood of a human, by a human shall that person's blood be shed. And third, this applies also to an animal which sheds human blood. Genesis has further told us that God made this covenant both with humanity and with all life on earth for as long as the earth endures. According to God's covenant with Noah, any who murder a human being, whether the perpetrator is human or animal, is to be executed by a human being. Why should this be? God explained this law simply and tersely as follows: For in his own image, God made humankind. In the covenant of Noah, God did not distinguish between those who commit murder intentionally and those who might do so accidentally. That clarification was not given to humanity by God until the covenant of Sinai given through Moses thousands of years after the Great Flood. And it was in this further clarification of God's requirement of capital punishment for those who murder human beings that God required the founding of cities of refuge. The full revelation of God on this matter can be found in Numbers chapter 35, verses 9 through 34, which has preserved God's requirements as follows. Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the Israelites and say to them, When you cross the Jordan into the land of Canaan, then you shall select cities to be cities of refuge for you, so that a slayer who kills a person without intent may flee there. The city shall be for you a refuge from the avenger, so that the slayer may not die until there is a trial before the congregation. We have encountered the Hebrew word translated without intent previously in our series through Deuteronomy. It's the Hebrew word shagah and refers to an act done without malice or a forethought. Continuing in Numbers 35, now in verse 13. The cities that you designate shall be 6 cities of refuge for you. You shall designate 3 cities beyond the Jordan and 3 cities in the land of Canaan to be cities of refuge. These 6 cities shall serve as refuge for the Israelites, for the resident or transient alien among them, so that anyone who kills a person without intent may flee there. But anyone who strikes another with an iron object, and death ensues, is a murderer. The murderer shall be put to death. Or anyone who strikes another with a stone in hand that could cause death, and death ensues, is a murderer. The murderer shall be put to death. Or anyone who strikes another with a weapon of wood in hand that could cause death, and death ensues, is a murderer. The murderer shall be put to death. The avenger of blood is the one who shall put the murderer to death. When they meet, the avenger of blood shall execute the sentence. Likewise, if someone pushes another from hatred, or hurls something at another, lying in wait, and death ensues, or in enmity strikes another with the hand, and death ensues, then the one who struck the blow shall be put to death. That person is a murderer. The avenger of blood shall put the murderer to death when they meet. In these verses, God provided 2 clarifications to the covenant he had made with all humanity in the person of Noah. The first was a clarification as to what sorts of acts would constitute murder in God's eyes. To be a murderer in God's eyes requires a person to have murdered beyad ramah, that is, high-handedly, intentionally, maliciously. The second was a clarification as to who should execute the death sentence. According to the covenant of Sinai, the death sentence should be enacted by the avenger, or more literally, the redeemer of blood. The language used here suggests that this person should have been a ranking family member of the one who was murdered. Continuing again in Numbers chapter 35, now in verse 22. But if someone pushes another suddenly without enmity, or hurls any object without lying in wait, or while handling any stone that could cause death, unintentionally drops it on another and death ensues, though they were not enemies and no harm was intended, then the congregation shall judge between the slayer and the avenger of blood in accordance with these ordinances. And the congregation shall rescue the slayer from the avenger of blood. Then the congregation shall send the slayer back to the original city of refuge. The slayer shall live in it until the death of the high priest who was anointed with holy oil. But if the slayer shall at any time go outside the bounds of the original city of refuge, and is found by the avenger of blood outside the bounds of the city of refuge, and is killed by the avenger, no blood guilt shall be incurred. For the slayer must remain in the city of refuge until the death of the high priest. But after the death of the high priest, the slayer may return home. The Lord then proceeded to establish a different set of requirements for a person who murdered another without intent or malice or forethought. Such a person was to live in one of the 6 cities of refuge until his or her trial was completed. And then, in the case that the murder the person committed was found to be accidental or in some other way unintentional, said person would have to remain in one of the cities of refuge until the death of the then current high priest. If the person left the city of refuge prior to the death of the high priest, then a family member of the deceased would have been permitted to execute the person for the murder of his or her kin without penalty. If the person left the city of refuge after the death of the high priest, however, then he or she was not to be executed. Continuing now in verse 29. These things shall be a statute and ordinance for you throughout your generations wherever you live. If anyone kills another, the murderer shall be put to death on the evidence of witnesses, but no one shall be put to death on the testimony of a single witness. Moreover, you shall accept no ransom for the life of a murderer who is subject to the death penalty. A murderer must be put to death. Nor shall you accept ransom for one who has fled to a city of refuge, enabling the fugitive to return to live in the land before the death of the high priest. You shall not pollute the land in which you live, for blood pollutes the land, and no expiation can be made for the land, for the blood that is shed in it, except by the blood of the one who shed it. You shall not defile the land in which you live, in which I also dwell, for I, Yahweh, dwell among the Israelites. This section of the Covenant of Sinai concludes with a reminder that these statutes and ordinances are never to be changed among the people of Israel, along with the following further clarifications. First, a murderer is not allowed to buy himself or herself out of an execution. Second, a person who commits accidental or unintentional murder may not buy himself or herself out of living in a city of refuge until the death of the high priest. Third, the murder of a human being pollutes or profanes or makes unholy the land, and the land can only be made pure again by the death of the one who committed the murder. Fourth, to fail to execute those who murder defiantly is to make the land in which one lives unclean. And fifth, God will not dwell in such a land, nor will he be with such a people. Returning to our primary passage in Deuteronomy, given these stipulations, it's not surprising that Moses established the 3 cities of Bezer, Ramoth Gilead, and Golan as cities of refuge on the eastern side of the Jordan River. When we study passages, such as those we've considered today, we might wonder of what use these stipulations should be put today. First, we must recognize that the new covenant of Jesus, which we find expressed and explained in the New Testament scriptures, assumes the authority and inspiredness of the passages we've been considering. For instance, the requirement God gave to Noah that animals were not to be eaten with their blood was called upon by the early church as they considered what behaviors the church should require of Gentiles who became followers of Jesus. St. James, the half-brother of Jesus, concluded the debate as follows in Acts chapter 15, verses 19 to 20. Therefore, I have reached the decision that we should not trouble those Gentiles who are turning to God, but we should write to them to abstain only from things polluted by idols, and from fornication, and from whatever has been strangled, and from blood. That's Acts chapter 15 again, verses 19 to 20, so it's in the New Testament. And in this passage, James isolated laws of God which were given to humanity prior to the giving of the covenant of Sinai to Israel. For James, whatever the stipulations of Sinai might have been for the Jewish people, the following requirements were, according to Scripture, for all humanity, irrespective of race or creed. First, humans are not to worship gods other than the God of Israel. Second, humans are to abstain from fornication, that is, from sexual activities which would later be prohibited by the covenant of Sinai, but are implicit in God's command to men and women to marry and produce children. Third, humans are to abstain from strangled animals, that is, from animals whose lifeblood is not drained before the preparation is made to eat them. Fourth, humans are to abstain from consuming blood. All of these requirements are to be found in the first two covenants God made with humanity in the book of Genesis, namely, the covenant made upon humanity's creation and the covenant God made with Noah. The implication of the determination of the early church in Acts chapter 15 is, of course, that Christians are to continue to live into the spirit of the laws God gave to all humans from the beginning of creation and from the aftermath of the flood, especially as those laws have been further elucidated by the covenant of Sinai given to Israel, and as those laws have been fulfilled in the life, teachings, ministry, death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus. Therefore, all who follow God today should also abstain from the worship of gods other than Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who became flesh in the person of Jesus, and has revealed himself to us as existing eternally as one God in three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Furthermore, all who follow the one true God should abstain from fornication, that is, from all sexual behaviors which are not implicit in God's command to be fruitful and multiply, and have been prohibited by the covenant of Sinai. Even more, God's people should not eat meat if the animal's blood has not been drained prior to the preparation of the meat. And finally, God's people should not consume blood directly. Why should these requirements with respect to blood be followed? God told Noah that the blood was a creature's life, that is, a creature's nephesh in Hebrew. The Hebrew word nephesh is sometimes translated soul in English, but that is a misleading translation. In Genesis, we're told that God took dust, formed it into a human shape, and then breathed the breath of life into it. It was through this that the human became, according to Genesis, a nephesh, a living being. Later then, God told Noah that the life, literally the nephesh of a creature, was its blood. Materially, we too have discovered that oxygen is brought to the body through means of the blood. This medium through which the breath of God and the material body are connected is sacred to God and must be returned directly to the earth when it is poured out. More than this we cannot say with certainty. This is God's will for those who are his people. The fate of a murderer and the cities of refuge are intimately connected with the sacredness God attaches to blood. A person who kills another, who separates the breath of God from the material body, has done more than murdered a person. That person has separated a person from the life-giving breath of God. That person has stepped between God and a living person. To do such a thing, according to God, is to forfeit one's life. To say it another way, God wishes that any who violently separate a human from the life-giving breath of God, any who would dare step between God and one of his creatures, are themselves separated from his life-giving breath. This separation is symbolized in the pouring out of blood, and according to God, to fail to do this is to separate God from the entire community in which the murderer lives. The ethics of capital punishment have long been debated in the nations of the earth. But one thing should be clear to those who claim to worship Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Any nation who fails to execute those who, with intention and a forethought, murder another human being will be separated from God. God will not walk with those who will not obey him in this way or live according to what he has asked of us. And of course, as we saw in Numbers, to be convicted for this sort of murder required 2 or 3 witnesses. And the covenant of Sinai also forbade the bearing of false witness against a neighbor. In the covenant of Sinai, if a person bore false witness and was discovered, then whatever the penalty might have been for the person about whom they lied would become their penalty. Even so, if false testimony led to the death of an innocent person, the promise of God to Israel was that he himself would execute judgment on those who temporarily had escaped human judgment. This type of a miscarriage of justice happened to God himself as he tabernacled among us in the person of Jesus. And still, Jesus submitted to the requirements of the covenant of Sinai by allowing himself to be executed. And in so doing, Jesus gave the judgment of those who bore false witness against him to the Father. For those who believe in such a God, the fear of a miscarriage of justice would never become a justification for disobedience. For we know that if human beings conspire to perjure themselves and commit a miscarriage of justice, God is watching, and God will undo their work, raise the innocent, and bring judgment upon the wicked. In conclusion, the Covenant of Sinai's requirement for the establishment of cities of refuge reveals a great deal to us about the justice and mercy of God. First, God recognizes that not all murders are the same. Some murder maliciously, intentionally, or they intend to harm people, and that harm results in death. Others commit murder by accident, or precipitate the death of others through unforeseen and unintended consequences in which there is no malice. God does not treat all murders the same. God looks to the heart of a person to determine those who require punishment and those who do not. However, second, the murder of a human being is no trivial matter for God. Even those who do so accidentally bear a guilt that is not easily set aside. For God, there are consequences to be borne in this life for the death of a human being, even if that death was unintended and unforeseen. This tells us that human beings are sacred in God's sight, and their deaths bring uncleanness to a land. When a person's negligence results in the death of another, one must be willing to bear the consequences God would require. Only in this way can the person be saved and the land restored. Third, God reveals that the desire of family members for justice and even vengeance in response to the death of a loved one is right and just. God even blesses this instinct as a trace of the justice of God in their hearts. However, in the Covenant of Sinai, God placed restraints on this righteous indignation. God required the family members to wait for a trial and a verdict before they acted. God required the family to abide by the findings of the community and not to take matters into their own hands in rebellion against the community's findings. And, in the case that a person was found innocent of intentional murder, or malicious murder for that matter, God also provided cities in which the people could live, which would allow the surviving family members some time to avoid having to live with and interact with the person who had committed this sin against them. Finally, the requirement of God that a person who committed the unintentional murder was to live in a city of refuge until the death of the high priest reminds us that for God, the high priest carried the sins of the people of Israel before God, as was recapitulated every year when the high priest entered the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur, that is, the Day of Atonement. When the high priest died, so did the unintentional sins of the people whom he served accompany him to the grave. This was a foreshadowing of the death of Jesus for us, when he, as our high priest who knew no sin, became sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God. May those who have ears to hear listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. Amen.